All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Be a Warrior podcast. And I am excited that we are into week 3 of Limb Loss, Limb Difference Awareness Month. And our theme, The Future is Now, while we are highlighting students, university students from around our nation and what they are doing and working on in the field of engineering, biomedical engineering, mechanical engineering, and research on what they're doing to help the amputee community. Today, I have Ophelie Herve from UCLA, and welcome. It is great to have you here.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me on.
And did I get your name right?
You did. You mastered it.
Okay, so for those of you that caught my French accent,
There, yes.
she is from France,
Yes.
and it took me a little while to get that first name nailed, but I think I got it.
It's a hard
Hopefully,
one. Yeah. And it throws
hopefully.
people off because of my Texas twang on some. Yeah, I'm from France, but grew up in Texas. So I'm kind of and now live in California. So kind of a weird mix of things.
Mix of things. Well, that takes us now to who you are. So, can you give us a little bit of a background on where you kind of grew up, what kind of life you had, and how you ended up at UCLA?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, I was born in France, but I grew up in Texas. So, definitely a third culture kid as I grew up in a very French home, but in the middle of Austin, Texas. And then I went to school in Dallas and then did my undergrad and my master's there, and then ended up at UCLA. But to kind of explain, I think, how I got into the field, right? So, it's been
Mhm.
over a decade now that I've been studying mechanical engineering because I'm in my
Wow.
fifth year of my PhD, about to wrap up, which is really exciting.
Very.
But it started off, in high school, my junior year of high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do something with medicine, maybe. My mom was like, "Oh, you'd be a great doctor." But it became very apparent to me that I do not do well with blood. And so medical school seemed a little
Me too.
challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But during my junior year in high school was actually, unfortunately, when the Boston Marathon bombing happened. And my family, we always watched the news in the morning, and that was kind of at that time a very obviously very big topic. And I remember just seeing some of the athletes come on and sharing their stories about their experience and kind of the post getting a prosthetic. And that was actually my first exposure to prosthetics. So I was, in this season of life where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, knew I wanted to do something medical, didn't like blood, but I was also a very big athlete growing up, played soccer all the time. Especially as an athlete, you kind of admire the marathon runners, and getting to hear their
Yeah.
stories was really inspiring to me. And it also, I think, drew me into, okay, I can do medical things, but maybe there's not blood involved in prosthetics, right? It's
Right.
fake limbs. And that was
Right.
very,
Right.
kind of more tangible for me to get involved in.
Okay.
And I think more than anything, I'm such an empathetic person, and kind of just hearing their stories really impacted me because I remember seeing, one day you see these athletes and they're the marathon runners and they're praised for their athletic ability. And then the next day, and it kind of made me realize kind of how society is shaped and in a lot of bad ways and negative ways of how we view people with amputation sometimes. And because they were now
Mhm.
getting questioned about their athletic ability when the day before, 24 hours ago, they were getting praised for it. And it was my first realization of really the gap here is technology. Like, they're the same person that they were yesterday. And if they
Right.
had the capability of having access to a prosthetic limb that allowed them to go about their life, they weren't necessarily very different in their cardio and their health. It was just that they needed a leg that was suitable to their needs and to what they wanted to do to enhance
Mhm.
their quality of life and resume the same activities that they loved to do before. And so that was really what brought me into the space, is seeing this gap in technology that was really the gap in quality of life for these
Right.
people who are affected with something completely out of their control, right? And I think amputation too is something that I was also learning, in my naive high school mind. I was like, oh, it must be something, with the veterans, and I just didn't realize like how
Right.
common it is. Even your story,
Yes.
that was
Yes.
is something, we don't really realize that we take for granted so often, having two legs or two arms and being able to do things without thinking about it. And So that was kind of my introduction into the space. So that's why I
Interesting.
chose mechanical engineering because I thought, at least I can try to build these prosthetics. And so I went
There
off
you go.
to school in Dallas at SMU to study
Okay.
mechanical engineering, but did my a biomedical specialization with that because I thought, always have that backup of going to medical school.
Right.
And then come full circle at my senior year, there was a professor, Dr. Villarreal, who arrived and he was doing research in the exoskeleton and prosthetic world. And so
Okay.
got to join his lab and I did my senior capstone with him and he offered me the opportunity to stick around and get my master's in that lab. So I spent another 2 years specifically studying prosthetic and exoskeleton
Wow.
controls, which I can talk a little bit more about if you want.
Yeah, we
And
will.
then yeah. And then, one thing led to another, and I had the opportunity to get a PhD. And so I applied to a lot of different schools. And that was kind of a shift in my research because as much as I've enjoyed, and loved diving into the prosthetic and exoskeleton world, there was an opportunity that I had to join the UCLA, the lab that I'm in at UCLA, and focus a little bit more on the surgical innovation side and specifically look at injury prevention. And so, because I think one thing that I became really aware of in my master's was okay, how can we build prosthetics and exoskeletons that meet these needs? But I was also getting very interested in the health and wellness space of how can I broaden this for my research just in my PhD of looking at how do we prevent any injury like before anything happens.
It gets to that. Yeah.
And so I've been researching ACL injury prevention in my PhD, kind of a throwback to my soccer days a little bit.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
so I've been doing that and ironically tore my own ACL 4 years in. So I'm just experiencing everything at the moment. And yeah, so but in our lab, there are students who work on prosthetics. And so I'm still exposed to that space in the surgical innovation side and still very much up to date with what's going on in that world, even though I no
Mhm.
longer am devoting my 80 hours like the hours of my day to that.
Well, that's great. And I'm going to go all the way back to that very beginning when you had
Yeah.
found the empathy with the Boston um,
Mm-hmm.
marathon and that episode where it
Right.
was catastrophic for those people, right? And
Yeah.
anybody around them. But it's interesting because having been in that space of being an athlete all my life, that was my identity. You can relate to that as a soccer player. You
Mm-hmm.
become an athlete, and that's who I always knew I was. And I mean, literally hurt my own self in karate in my 40s. I was still
Mm-hmm.
in mentally, even though I was a wife, a mom, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
I was an athlete.
Mm-hmm.
And when someone like that gets into a situation that that's what causes their amputation, and you think your world is ending, you really do, because when your identity is wrapped up in one very hardy identity, like an athlete,
Mm-hmm.
it is very
Yeah.
hard to be humbled by the lack of activity. And
Mm-hmm.
I can totally understand what you're saying when you say the empathy there that you wanted to help them because there is stigma. We're seeing a lot of stigma
Yeah.
around and some's good, some's bad. Some of it is I will get approached at least once a week on if I served our country. And I'm like, not
Yeah.
all amputees are people that served. And
Mm-hmm.
it makes me feel bad. Like maybe I should have served. That's probably would have been honorable. Nope, it was a karate accident. But and then you have others that are the stigma is negative because of
Mm-hmm.
diabetes. And so you'll see people
Right.
that are struggling with their weight that have lost because of vascular issues and diabetes have lost limbs because of that. And then you've got
Mm-hmm.
the accidents, and I mean, those are some big, and cancer. So those are some big, you
Mm-hmm.
know, things that shape amputees or where they come from.
Right.
And when you talk about that, and I could see that, I mean, gosh, I didn't know an amputee growing up. I never even saw them. They weren't as prevalent as they are today.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, and that is the reason why this month I wanted to circle around and see what was coming up in the amputee community for those of
Mm-hmm.
us that want to get back to that athletic mentality.
Yeah.
Like that was my first goal. I want to get back to skiing. I want to get back to the
Yeah.
gym. I want to be healthy. Just because I'm missing a leg or a body part doesn't mean I can't still achieve those. And we are seeing those boundaries being
Absolutely.
pushed
Right.
every day, every year by
Hmm.
amputees from
Yeah.
as high levels Paralympians, going all
Hmm.
over the world and competing to just the everyday person getting out and learning to play wheelchair tennis or
Hmm.
doing weightlifting competitions and still creating a body that doesn't look like
Hmm.
the missing part is a problem for them. So it's very
Right.
interesting, and I love the fact, and quite frankly, you're my first female student to come on, and you may be my only one. So go, girl!
Woo!
So excited. But I love the fact that you morphed, and you saw where the
Hmm.
needs were and where your interests lie. And of course, you want to go where your interests lie because that means that you'll be
Hmm.
more invested in what your project is. And it's
Hmm.
a long road to get your PhD. So
Woo! Yeah.
let's
Oh
get
yeah.
back to your undergrad was in mechanical engineering.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And
I've
what was
been,
your, go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead. I was gonna
I
say
was,
I've been in mechanical engineering the whole time, undergrad,
okay.
master's,
True. Okay. So, but your
and
undergrad is a degree with mechanical engineering.
hmm
Yes. And what was your
yes.
senior capstone project?
So my senior capstone project was we basically were building a portable sensing device that had let's see, different sensors that could track, joint angles, the muscle activation, and ground reaction forces in kind of a portable system. So imagine leggings that have a bunch of wires all over them and sensors attached. And I remember we literally bought Lululemon leggings and like cut holes in
Really?
them. It was
Oh,
ridiculous. And attached a bunch of sensors. And the idea was in a laboratory, that's where we're getting all this data to create prosthetics off of, like the powered
right.
prosthetics. We're using laboratory data that we're getting off of people walking and running in a laboratory setting, and obviously in a laboratory setting it can be kind of contrived. And so the idea
Right.
was, what if we made a portable system? And this was again, 7 years ago, or
Right.
gosh, longer than that. Yeah, 7 years ago. So there's been a lot of work in this space, but this was kind of our
Sure.
early on idea. But the idea was, yeah, let's make a portable system so we can have people actually walking, wearing this device, wearing these leggings, and go walk outside, walk on uneven terrain, go play sports, and really get some real life data about joint angles and their muscle activation and their ground reaction forces, to then use that as a baseline to kind of develop different control mechanisms for prosthetic and exoskeletons. And so that was kind of the senior design project that I was working on, that led me to, that was like working in this lab with this advisor who had more vision for the exo and prosthetic world.
Okay.
So that was my
And
undergrad
did you
research.
use two-legged people for that data so that you could see how legs moved appropriately to
Exactly.
recreate a limb for, okay. That's neat.
Exactly.
Okay. I just didn't know because I have been a part of some
Yeah.
studies where I am the guinea pig. And
Right.
because they want to see how the prosthesis is working with the human
Right.
body. But you were
Right.
actually looking at how the human body works to build something that could withstand the torque and the ankle turn and the adjustments and things like that. Got
Exactly. You got it. You got
got
it.
it. Okay, so then you moved on and you went into your master's. And then what was your
Yep.
master's program working on?
Yeah, so my master's, I was working on, so I kind of transitioned from that undergraduate project with this advisor to a taking on an independent project for my master's within that lab. So it was a little bit of a buildup. But still working in the same lab. And there I did again mechanical engineering, but I was my special, like the minor track, or the track that I was on, was just dynamics and controls. And so
Okay.
specifically controls is what I was doing there. And what I mean by that is I was kind of, my research focused on trying to figure out new ways to create to control powered prosthetics. So
Right.
a lot of I'm not exactly sure what the state of the art, or what is the most used prosthetic at the moment by amputees. So maybe you can tell me if you have a powered or a passive prosthetic. Actually, do you have a
My
powered?
Mine's, well, it's a microprocessor, so I don't
Okay.
think it's underpowered with my insurance company, but it's an electric, so it's a microprocessor knee. This
Okay.
the
Okay.
Autobach. It's the Autobach
Gotcha.
brand.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So there's kind of a range of
Mhm.
prosthetic legs that you can get, right? You can have
Right.
one that you have to actively swing it, and then there's
Right.
others that the knee joint will, as you step it, it has like a
Right.
powered
Movement. It
extension.
actually,
Yeah,
yeah, right.
exactly, a powered extension. And so that powered extension has been studied of how best to make that work, because the idea is you want it to have that power and that bust of energy at the right exact moment
Yes.
so that the person lands correctly. You want it to extend the right amount, and so there's a lot of research in this kind of state space control, is what they call it, in the
Got it.
sense of like,
Okay.
does the prosthetic know if you're in the state of walking? Does it know if you're in the state of going upstairs or running? And there's different control mechanisms for each of these
Yeah, that's
little buckets of motion, right? If you're walking, your knee needs to do something different than if you're going upstairs,
right.
or if you're running, so there's, in a powered prosthetic, there's kind of these different algorithms that can be developed for these different motions, or these different states, as they call it. Um, and so what I was working on is trying to use kind of that data that we were able to
Wow.
get from my undergrad. And I actually used a lot of open source data just from laboratories that
Right.
have provided their data online,
Right.
to kind of look at the data and say, okay, is there another way that we could develop this control algorithm? And so specifically, I was able to publish a conference paper and
Mm.
share the findings of that research. And essentially what we showed is that if you know the person's hip angle, there might be a way to basically use that hip angle to determine what the knee angle and the ankle angle should be. And the
Wow.
idea there is that, most people with amputation still have their hip. And
Right.
so if there was a way to measure their hip, maybe put a sensor there that's attached to the prosthetic, then they could in real time control their knee and their ankle just based on their hip angle. And the reason that was really cool at the time, or that we found interest in it, is that you didn't have to have this kind of state thing. You could be walking and transition to running based on your hip angle,
Yeah.
or based on stairs, and or even walk backwards. Like, a lot of the
Right.
time you might not want to finish your step. If there's something on the ground that you want to
Right.
avoid, you want to step back all of a sudden. And if your knee's
Like my
already going in
puppy.
front of you, yeah, exactly, like your puppy. And if your knee's already going for it, well, you
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
really step back very easily and stay balanced. And so
Right.
the idea there was, oh, if we could, just use the hip angle, you would be able to kind of have this backdrive ability. You would be able to go forward, backward. Um, and so that was really cool, because we kind of saw that, and that was a very theory based PhD. I didn't get to,
Okay.
test it or try it out on a prosthetic leg,
Okay.
but it was really cool just seeing the data and saying, okay, this could actually work if we did they call it a PID controller, but essentially showed the math and the theory behind the idea and said, hey, this could maybe be something that is worth exploring in the prosthetic development.
Well, I'll tell you what, just hearing that, no, I can tell you right now, my brain doesn't work that way. So God bless you for those of you that can do that and make it a better life for me. For those people listening, I mean, some of the things she's saying, we talk about hip contractures a lot in the amputee
Okay.
world. So if you go into getting your prosthesis fitted, but you haven't been stretching that hip flexor.
Mm,
So for me, I spent 5 years crutching. I mean, think about someone with a broken leg and
mm,
they hold their leg up a little bit, right? So
yeah.
it tightens the hip flexor.
Right.
Well, when you lop off a leg, you have no weight and gravity, and all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you realize you're looking down and your one residual limb is sticking out further. That was the hip contracture. And
Mm-hmm.
people will look at you'll see different, not all structures are made the same for amputees, and
Mm-hmm.
I believe a lot of it is based on their hip alignment, whether
Mm,
the way their hips are, but also the contracture. Because if you are working with the contracture, they might have to set back the leg different a little bit to the back. So you'll see
mm,
sometimes a socket here, and then the leg is shifted here because it's
mm,
it's got to take into account the change in the angle. So
Oh,
I've seen that,
interesting.
and people will get online, amputees will get online and be like, why does my leg look so weird? I feel like my guy did it wrong. And we're like,
Mm,
so do you have a hip contracture? Because if you look down and your leg is sti sticking up,
yeah.
it's probably to accommodate that. And that can change over time as long as you
Mm,
start stretching. So it's interesting to hear you talk about the hip angle and what you can
yeah.
do, and using something that's more powered like that is I've gotten to try something like that. It is definitely different than my microprocessor leg where my
Hmm.
gives my motion, but
Hmm.
my processor makes it so it senses if I'm falling and won't allow
Yeah.
me to give. It doesn't just give and let me drop. It slows that down. It feels the gait is wrong. But I have
Mm,
tried the powered one. Wow. There's a lot behind that that
hmm.
I'm so used to having to work hard to step that
Right.
it's a very different feel. It is the power is definitely the right term for that. There is a
Mm,
lot of power behind some of those. But that's really
mm,
interesting that you did that. And the fact that, I mean, again, like to be able to stick with something and you're working on all the number game and the algorithms and all
mm,
of that mathematical side of it,
hmm.
but really not seeing the hands-on.
Hmm.
Some people I've talked to say that what brings them joy is being able to tinker and
Right.
a part of that. And some people obviously are really great at researching and numbers and putting the data together, which then
Hmm.
makes it easier for someone to create the thing they can build,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Have you ever been on a building side? I mean, the leggings is kind of on that
Yeah.
side.
Yeah, well, and I think that's why I was so fascinated by joining that master's program was I got to tinker a lot in that
Yeah.
senior design project. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is so fun." And then I went into the master's and it was me behind a computer 8 hours a day. Like it was
Oh,
all
brutal.
coding and all looking at data and
Wow.
I want to say about the hip contracture, that's really interesting because I wonder, I took just going back to that master's thing for a
Mhm.
second, is I was looking at the data, as I said, from people with two legs. We're looking at data from people with both legs. And so I wonder if some of those findings would have changed had we looked
Oh,
at, the data for someone, the contralateral limb of someone with an amputation. I wonder if we would have
yeah.
seen the same things. That was just an interesting, but I
Yeah.
think it still could help because I don't
Well,
know,
yeah.
especially accounting for all that hip contracture. But anywho, that was just a side note. But
Well, no, and it's true, but I mean, even a hip contracture that can change for a person if they start
mhm,
designing their days around stretching that out. They can get back to like ground zero with what their other hip looks
mm,
like, you know. So that
gotcha.
can change. I think it's fascinating though because a prosthetist needs to know that about the angle and how they set up a leg. And again,
Hmm.
that is so over my head. It's incredible that there is so much uniqueness, and I don't think people understand. It's not just about the socket build. It is also
Hmm.
about the placement of, when I get a new socket and he puts in the new ring, we have to do a left, right, adductor, abductor kind of
Hmm.
adjustment to work with my gait. Otherwise, I get what we call like a snap with my walk. I'll feel like my
Mm,
leg is snapping around
mapping.
and it's and
Gotcha.
it gets me off balance because my legs shouldn't be moving in that direction. So then we have to
Right.
think a little bit each time I get a new socket. So,
Mm,
that, I mean, it's an interesting, it's definitely a mathematical world.
yeah.
It is,
Well, and
we
it's
need
so
more people like you
personalized.
guys. It is very
Yeah.
personalized. We
It's
need
so
more of you.
personalized. And that's what I've, in just medicine in general, and especially in my PhD, that's what I've been learning. And I think, yeah, so going back to that question of, so I did a lot of hands on in my senior project. And then in my master's, it was mainly data analysis and just a lot of math and theory. And I did not enjoy it as much, even though I was able to push through. I think the reason that I've kept going this long is because of the why I was interested, which always goes
Right.
back to that Boston Marathon in my junior
Yeah.
year. And that's what I tell people whenever they consider a PhD is I said, well, why are you doing it? Because that is the only thing that's going to get you through. And because I've, wanted to quit several times throughout the
I
PhD process
bet.
because it's so hard. And then you go back to like, okay, what in the world brought me into this and why did I want to start? And I think that's kind of what's kept me going.
Good.
But in my master's, I still realized, okay, I don't love staying completely theory. Like I don't love being on the mathematical side just because it felt so removed from the
Right.
end product as you're talking about. And especially as
Yeah.
someone who's quite social, as you can probably tell, and
Yes.
wants to make an impact and see that and like see
Yeah.
people benefit from what I'm working on. I was desiring to be a little bit closer to the end user or have more exposure to something more hands-on. And so that's kind
Yeah.
of what led to the shift that I had going into my master's, what or my PhD. I'm sorry, my PhD,
Yeah.
because that was in this lab that was doing surgical innovation. We were working with orthopedic surgeons. I collaborate
That's
with a
cool.
surgeon. And I guess you have to be careful what you wish for because now I'm suffering
Right.
from my ACL injury. So I'm very hands on.
And your new why.
And my new why, exactly, exactly. But yeah, so I think I've gotten and now I've gotten to be a lot more hands-on. I mean, my PhD research is, as I said, I'm looking into ACL injury prevention. And so I'm trying to
Yeah.
understand what are the mechanisms of injury. And this is all scalable to, again, a lot of the things that we see with people with amputation of the what's the word I'm looking for? Like the compensation, like how do we prevent some of
Big
these
time.
these contralateral injuries that happen as a result of weaknesses. And so I'm learning a lot about that space
Yeah.
and now I'm very hands-on because I work with cadavers and robots. And so my PhD, I'm on the robotics track. And so we work a lot
Well,
with
I'd say you and the
robots and
blood. Ooh,
I know.
yeah.
I made it full circle. I should have maybe just done medical school because I'm kind of there now working with these orthopedic surgeons. But
Oh,
yeah.
goodness. Well, yeah, and I think that's really neat. And you've when you and I talked before, that was
Hmm.
why I thought for those of you listening, like, the other two people that I've had on had a prototype of something they're working on hands on. That's why I brought that up with
Hmm.
her. But there is the other aspect. And as a woman amputee, I work with a lot of
Hmm.
other women amputees. And
Yep.
we don't just talk about, oh, woe is me. I can't get back to my life and I cook meals and da da da, women things like
Hmm.
we all, because we're all around my age. There are some youngers. But we do talk about compensation and
Hmm.
what it's going to look like as we get older. Women deal with bone density issues as we get older, and
Yeah.
just you've arthritis is a big thing, and just having everything, all the pressures on the good side of the body. And a lot
Hmm.
of these women have also come out from injuries like car accidents and stuff where they already had a broken leg on the side that is good, and
Hmm. Hmm.
they are struggling with an ankle injury because they snapped both ankles, but one didn't make it in the fusion.
Hmm.
And so they're already dealing with aches and pains now. What's it going to look
Yeah.
like 5, 10, 20 years down the road as we age? And we're
Yeah.
trying to work with something as heavy as a prosthetic. I mean, I picture like my parents or my grandparents and being an amputee at an older age. What does it look like for our rest of our body, our hip, our knee, our
Hmm.
ankle, our back, which then stems all the way up, and we can do things to our posture, right?
Right.
So you talk about that, and you did say that as your PhD, are you working more on the women's dynamics of this?
Yes, so that's a great question and something that I think about a lot and kind of brings me back to thinking about prosthetics even as I look for a job, right?
Yeah,
Or prosthetic development as I look for a job.
yeah,
Is because of that. I think throughout my PhD, what I've come to learn is that ACL injuries, women are more susceptible to ACL injuries than men, about 2 to 8 times more likely, depending on the sport and activity level, two to
wow,
eight times more likely to tear their ACL than men. And so what's become really interesting that I've kind of dived into throughout the
yeah,
last 2 years on my own. This will never see the light of day in my dissertation, but I've done a lot of self-study in women's health and understanding the menstrual cycle, understanding peak performance for athletes who are women and how that differs in training and how that differs in demand from men because there's not a lot of understanding in that space. A lot of the training
so
programs, a
true.
lot of the rehab protocols, all of that has been studied on male specific subjects and cohorts of men, and it hasn't been studied on women. And we're starting to see that change in the
Good.
last decade or so, but there's still not enough research in that space, especially when it comes to how the menstrual cycle affects women's bodies and how that affects their performance and how that affects injury. And so that's where I've become really passionate of educating myself on women, because I think a main reason for this gap in the injury the vulnerability to injury,
Right.
specifically ACL injury, is because there's just a lack of understanding and education of women's bodies and how they're different from men and how
Interesting.
they need to be trained differently, and how hormones affect the laxity of our ligaments, for example. So there's
Wow.
specific periods in the cycle where women's hormones are higher, and it's studies are showing that that could result in increased ligament laxity. So your ligaments are essentially more stretchy. And there's a hormone that when it's high, it causes your neuromuscular control to be worse or lessened. So you can imagine, oh my gosh, my ligaments are more stretchy and my response time is now lower. Of course,
Wow.
I'm going to get an injury. So understanding that, and that's not something that men are susceptible to because of their biochemistry and their physiology. And so I think
Wow.
that's very interesting to consider when we look at people with amputation and how do we design prosthetics or prostheses, I keep saying that correctly,
I know.
prostheses,
I know.
um, to to account for that, to account for women versus men. And should there be a difference in design? Probably, but I don't really see that in the market, right? Should there
No.
be and even, we talked about this earlier too with like the water retention for women. Our bodies fluctuate in weight literally monthly.
Yep.
And socket design is, shaped and molded
Static.
to a perfect, it's
It's static.
static.
Yep.
And so I think that is just some of the things that I've become more and more aware of through my PhD research. And even though I'm not researching that
Yeah.
anymore because of my background and because of the history that I have and the research that I've done in that
Yep.
space, I spent 3 to 4 years in that space specifically. It definitely is impacting the way that I remember that time and say, oh,
Yes.
I should have looked into that, or I should have considered that. And I think as a woman, I'm obviously more interested in that because it impacts me and I see the need. And so that's kind of where I've started to dive in over the last 2 years, is just helping, other people in my lab understand that we need to consider women differently. We need to have their voice heard and have them in studies um and incorporate them, especially, some of my coworkers do work on prosthetic design. And so telling them, hey, make sure you include this in your study, or have you considered
Yeah.
this, and just making sure that that is a voice that's being heard in the research space that I don't think has been in the past, in the past in general. So,
No, and it's interesting because, by all means, I have not done any research.
mhm,
I used to teach science, but at the middle school level. So, I
mhm,
got to dabble with a lot of different things. But now
yeah,
at where I'm at, which I would never have thought this was where my life was going to ever take me. This was a complete, what I
yeah,
thought was a derailment, but it was just a new journey. And then
mm,
to bring up, let's just work with women. Let's just talk with women. Let's have a safe space where we can talk about things because these are the things that we actually talk about. But I did not know that that's the door I was opening. And
mm,
then I met you and I was like, this is like perfect because we do talk about how we're different. It isn't in our heads. We are
mhm,
built differently. When we struggle and we see other people soaring, we have to be cognitive on are we looking at someone that's a different age dynamics than us, a
mhm,
different demographic, and are they male? I
mhm,
grew up with three big brothers, so I usually compete at such a high level that I can compete
mhm,
against men. Like that's where
mhm,
my brain goes. I go to the gym and I compete with myself, but to lift as much as I can, like with the guys, but
yep,
not seeing what the women are doing because I don't do the classes.
yep,
I like lifting weights, and
same,
there are some days I feel like I just can't, and I know that I'm in a different time frame in my female cycle. And
mhm,
that also plays a role. It has to because we're starting to see a depletion in the bone density or the calcium in our bodies and things like
mhm,
that. And maybe cutting some slack. I say to the ladies, have some grace with yourself.
Hmm.
because some of them are younger and going through their cycle. Some
Hmm.
have just gotten out of pregnancy,
Hmm.
not too long ago, and that does stuff to your body.
Oh,
And then there's
absolutely.
those of us that have gone perimenopausal or menopausal, and all of a
Hmm.
sudden you realize we're all women, but we're all struggling with a different internal makeup right now because of where we're
Hmm.
at in our life.
Hmm. Absolutely.
And it's interesting that you've thought about that, you've delved into it, and that's probably just the tip of the iceberg on where we're going to be going. Um,
Absolutely.
for women
Absolutely.
in sports, but amputee women in sports and just in life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah,
Do you
there's
think?
definitely, do I think
Do you think
if,
that that's something that will start being like looked into more, researched more? Do you see it
oh,
in your space yet at all besides you?
absolutely. Absolutely. Especially because I'm in that ACL injury space, I'm very tuned into all the research that's being done on athletes specifically. And as
Yeah.
women's sports is getting more traction, getting more money towards it, honestly, there's more
Yes.
research being done. And so there's a leading researcher that I follow. I'm actually reading her book right now, and she talks about this. Her name's Dr. Stacy Sims. I don't know if you've heard of her, but
Okay. Okay.
she does a lot of research. She's spent the last 3 decades looking into women specific peak performance. She was a marathon Ironman. She's a big athlete, but she saw this kind of the same things you're talking about of, man, I'm really
Mhm.
tired at certain parts of my cycle, or specifically
Mhm.
women in menopause. Actually, I would say menopause is something that a lot of traction is happening right now,
Really
because people, a lot of women who are going through that are having more injury, are breaking their bones because of that bone density
interesting.
losing. So there's a lot of reason to be looking into that. And so that's a huge space right now that's blowing up with research, in my opinion. And then specifically athletes. So young women who are athletes and how to train them accordingly. Because what we're seeing is there's research that's starting to gain traction and starting to try to understand, how do we train women as women. And Dr. Stacey Sims, the thing that I love about what she preaches is her whole slogan is women are not small men. And I think that slogan and that phrase is starting to gain traction in research, is that we can't keep saying women are, or we can't keep assuming women are built like men. Women are not small men. They are women. They're completely
Yeah.
different. They go through so many different phases of life. And as you said, there's so many specific seasons of life that are
Right.
we can't, pregnancy, nothing is similar to that in this world. And so
Yeah.
we need to start researching that specifically. And so what I'm seeing as someone who's more on the athletics and sports side of things is that is gaining traction. And I think we're only, a couple years away from starting to see that overflow into these different specific populations. So people with amputation and how design will be affected for that, or I mean, just all these different pockets of kind of more niche areas. I do think that
Yeah.
it's going to start overflowing, and I'm excited for that. And I think that's where I get really excited, because I've just really found my niche passion of just where does the intersection of technology and engineering and women's health all come together to help
Wow.
people, help us as women have better quality of life through every season and of life.
That is impressive and definitely a very, very unique niche, like you said. Like
Hmm.
you've got some very specifics in there, which will then, I'm
Hmm.
sure, just explode as we get, 5, 10 years down the road, even more so. Um,
Hmm.
with that being said, and we talk about like the weight gains and all that stuff, I mean, that's some things that people don't
Hmm.
really take into account when we get a very static socket. And mine
Yeah.
even more so. Mine is a skin fit, so I cannot use liners or anything to buffer when I lose weight. And
Mm.
if I gain
Mm.
weight, it ain't fitting in because I can't take anything to bring it down.
Mm.
We talk about that. Like, when it's that time and women need to be cognizant of that, if they're an amputee, especially that, when you're going through that time of the month, you might notice a fluctuation in weight and they might be like, oh my gosh, I'm gaining weight. I don't think a lot think about that as an
Right.
aspect of wearing their prosthesis and what
Hmm.
might take a woman out of her prosthesis for a week
Right.
or two. And that's
Hmm.
horrible. Like, I mean, I couldn't live without mine on. Like I really,
Right. And
mine's
you
on
shouldn't.
24/7, it's always
You
on.
shouldn't. Yeah.
Right.
You shouldn't
But
have to deal with that is mm-hmm.
and I think they've addressed some of that with some of the new systems now that are like the BOA systems where you can tighten and loosen the
Okay.
socket. But I will tell you that
Mm,
one thing my prosthetist had told me was he will never put me in one because
mm,
the more active you are, the more chances you are going to be in my office getting it fixed
mm,
because you're going to
mm-hmm.
bust it. You're going to work so hard, you're going to bust it. And
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
I hear people that say they use it and it's great. And it really is for those women that are struggling with a fit. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen them say this has been the best thing for me,
Mm-hmm.
but they may not be as active as this person or that person who they might try it and find that it's more of a pain for them to
Mm,
stay in that. So, then you sit there and go, well, how do you deal with something? Because getting a new socket isn't an overnight thing. It is a
right.
process of insurance companies getting involved, your prosthetist, the person that makes the socket, the liner and all that, and test socketing. And
Mm-hmm.
that could be a couple, 3, 4 week process
Right.
all in all. So every time you
Yeah.
fluctuate, you might have to, and you write it out. You figure out how to write it out.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what do you see happening for women that that will make those changes easier or more,
Mm.
I don't know, like smoother transitions from cycle to cycle? I mean, is there any way to regulate? Have you noticed anything that's
Oh, like
good for
regulating the
the
hormones and
and
things like
the
that.
yeah, or even the weight that's associated with that? I mean,
Yeah.
I
Well, and it's kind of so yes and no, because yes,
yeah,
there are things that there's lifestyle changes that you can make. There's
sure.
little things that you can do and there's a lot of things there's a lot of little things that you can do to manage your
Yeah,
hormones at the end of the day. And I
yeah,
think I've gotten due to my own health things that I've been going through, I've tried some of those and some of them have worked, some of them haven't. And it's very and I
mm,
think what's so challenging about this is it's not one size fits all in the sense of, I think another thing that I've become really passionate in with my ACL research is that it's so personalized. Like medicine is so personalized. And I think we're
yeah,
seeing that more and more. And especially when it comes to women, like there's no blanket formula for a woman. It's
yeah,
very specific to you're having a very specific experience. And like even something that frustrates me is every textbook you'll ever read right now is probably says a woman's cycle is 28 days on average. The reality is that is completely false. Every woman has a very different, there's women who have 40-day cycles. And so
yeah,
to kind of have this blanket statement and assumption of this is the woman's experience is
right,
just so frustrating because women are so different.
yeah,
And just like men are very different, but we have like different physiology that affects that too. And so there's definitely things that you can do to help regulate, especially if you have really intense symptoms or really intense fluctuations. There's
yes,
specific diet changes that you can look into. There's specific, supplements you can get and like different things like that. Obviously, talk to a doctor.
right,
But I think where I say, so yes, there's things that we can do.
right,
But the other side of me is like a woman in engineering is like, I'm also like, well, there's also things that engineers can do, that we can
sure.
work towards making. It shouldn't always have to be all on the women. And I think because women, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to begin with.
Ugh,
And when it
yes,
becomes such an over analyzing, overthinking of like, oh my gosh, I need to do this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and then just it gets such a long to do list of
right,
things to help our health. There's some things that we can let like release and let go of
yeah,
that control because technology does have the
mm,
capability to bridge that gap. And I think that's kind of where I love what you're doing with your podcast and with the community you've built because I look back at, when I was 17 in my junior year,
right,
the reason I got exposed to prosthetics was because I started hearing stories. I saw the gap in the technology
yep,
at that time, specifically just for let's get back to activity. There was a gap there.
yeah,
And so that's where I'm like, I'm so encouraged by you and the other women on your in your community, because I'm like, keep
Yeah,
sharing your stories. Like it's the stories that
exactly.
matter, because it's the stories that people hear where they're like, okay, maybe I'm not going through that, because that was my experience. Like I'm not going through
Yeah.
that, but I see a gap that I want to fill.
Yeah.
And so let me contribute. And so I think as women, I think there's been kind of a stigma of talking about the women experience, whether it comes to menstrual cycle. I think for a long time, no one ever talked about it, and no one ever talked
Yeah.
about these weight fluctuations. And just so I'm really encouraged by you and your platform, because I'm like, if you start talking about
Yeah.
it and making that problem known, then we can respond and say, oh, wow, that's a gap that we need to fill, and that can be filled,
Yes.
maybe, you know? And so
Yes.
I think it's definitely like having to come at the problem from two sides. Is there's only so much that you can ask of someone to do, but there's so much technology. I mean, look at our world, right? Like I don't think
There's
we can even fathom how much we can do
no.
and how far we can go. But it
Yeah.
starts by like knowing what the problem is so that we can address it. And that comes from hearing people's stories and having people resonate and relate. And
Yes.
I get the honor of being on the engineering side as a woman
I
and
love
saying, hey,
that.
I know these are problems. Like I'm trying to communicate them to my peers so that we can solve them.
Yeah. Well, I think, and we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing, I mean, go all the way back. We're starting to see such a push for women in STEM, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
they're starting much younger, like in the
Mm-hmm.
middle school
Yeah.
realm through high school. And we're starting to see that, which will then start to see a boom in looking at women's issues and stuff.
Right.
And that was truly, that was not what I expected to come from this small group of women that we talk every week,
Mm-hmm.
but it is really powerful because it lets each of us know we're okay. We
Right.
we have male prosthetists, we have male doctors, and then we have our spouse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
those are the people we fall back on. That is our support when we become an amputee. And there are some things that are very, very hard to talk to a man about, whether it's an embarrassing topic or one they just don't understand.
Right.
And it's really important that, any women listening, you find that community of women who get it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, none of the amputees on my group, I mean, we're all women, we're all different ages from, I think, 26 to 70 some years old. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're all in different phases of our life. We
Yep.
are we're married, we're widowed, we don't have a significant other, things all over the board.
Mm-hmm.
But you find a group that at least can understand some of those things and can talk to it through their own experience. And that's what we do. We don't talk medically because none of us are medically inclined and we don't have a degree in anything like
Mm-hmm.
that. But we can use our experience to allow, I always say that tuck it away in your mental toolbox. Like I always
Mm-hmm.
make note of when I was telling you about how I was having the stabbing pains this past week.
Mm-hmm.
I know from experience that the only time I have extremely bad phantom pains is when I tweak my lower back.
Mm.
And I may not feel it. I didn't notice my back was hurting, but my leg
Right.
felt it first. I get stabbing pains, literally feels like someone's stabbing a knife up my foot over and over again, too. It feels raw, like you would think there was flesh
Mm-hmm.
there being hit. And then it wasn't until a day later I started to get backaches that would run down the
Okay.
back of my legs. And I'm like, sciatic. Oh.
Yeah.
And sure enough, I can trail it back. I know this because the first couple of times that's happened, I was like, where was I? When did this happen? Okay. Okay. So I say the mental toolbox is a very valuable place to keep things stored when someone gives an experience that they're going through. So when a
Mm-hmm.
woman is dealing with something, we got to think about, well, geez, the last time, I had my cycle, I was squeezing it in my leg, which then caused pistoning, which then caused me not to wear my leg. And then
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden someone's like, oh, I remember when she said that. I wonder if that's what's happening to me.
Right.
You don't get that from I love my prosthetist, but I can't get that from them. They might
Yeah.
understand their wives, but they don't understand their wives like an amputee woman because she's not an
Mm-hmm.
amputee. And so we talk
Mm-hmm.
about those things. Now, on your end of it, just to go back to the injury prevention, let's talk about
Mm-hmm.
that for women. Like, what things can we be thinking about to
Mm.
preserve our good side, which might be damaged anyways, but the one that still is complete? What do we do as women? What are some things that you might have some insight on that you're learning
Mm.
about?
Yeah. Well, again, nothing that I'm doing is specific to I don't know if it can translate to
Right.
someone
But
with,
what are you
but
seeing? What are you researching
yeah,
about? Let's put it that way.
yeah, absolutely. Because I do think personally a lot of it is translational. However, I can't say, oh, I've studied this
Right.
and I have
Yes.
results on it. But from what
Good
I've been
disclaimer,
learning,
everybody listen, this is just
but
what she is seeing
yeah,
as a, but it's not necessarily tested and
right,
100% as we are all
right,
unique and individual. But what are some things that you're noticing? I mean, you said the
exactly.
cycle makes a difference. Are we more apt to
Absolutely.
be injured during it, right before it, right after it?
So that's a big question going on right now in the research space, and you see a lot of contradicting results, which is kind of confusing and hard to understand.
Interesting.
But and I think it's because we take like a lot of this research is on very specific like subpopulations of people, like for
Right.
example, like the Norwegian soccer team, and it's like 10
Yes.
people, like it's just very,
Right.
very specific things. And that's why
Sure.
you get this very
Oh,
um,
yeah.
contradicting results. But I will say, so I've kind of, narrowed my way down to looking at kind of the leading researchers in this
Yeah.
space. And as I said, Dr. Stacy Sims is someone who I really respect, and I've seen her research and kind of looked at other research in relationship to it,
Yeah.
and kind of tried to play devil's advocate and say, okay, well, I found other studies that support this, and I have. And so what I'll say is, I think the main thing I've seen is, so for people who are menstruating, there are certain parts of your cycle to be aware of. And again, I think this is where logging, like having a
Yeah.
personal journal or something that you can like track your cycle and make notes in, is super helpful. And that's, I think, the
Yeah.
first step every woman should do, is whether dealing with an injury, wanting to prevent injury, dealing with coming back through the rehab process with an
Right.
amputation, is just start being aware of how do you feel every day, and like track these symptoms and track your cycle and how you feel when you're working
Mhm.
out, because that's going to be the telltale true sign, the
Yeah.
biggest sign of when you feel like your performance is at its peak. But something to
Mhm.
consider is that when your hormones are high, so that would be the second half of your cycle. So when you start your period, that would be day one, through ovulation is like the first half of your period. And then
Mhm.
the second half is kind of the last up until you start again, right? So that
Yeah.
second half is when all of your hormones are going up. Your estrogen starting to go up, your progesterone starting to go up, and estrogen has been found to increase ligament laxity, what I was talking about earlier. And
Yeah.
progesterone, when it goes up, decreases your neuromuscular control. So that second half of your cycle is actually seems to be a time when you might be more prone to injury, because
Interesting.
increased ligament of lax or increased ligament laxity means your body's a little bit more stretchy. So your joints might be less stable because they can move more, right? So you're having to use your muscles more to
Okay.
compensate, to stabilize more. So that if your muscles aren't strong enough, you might be prone to that
Yeah.
destabilization. And then secondly, your neuromuscular control is down. So if you're having to try to use your muscles more, but you can't control it as quickly, if you're having to avoid a step or make a pivot, you might not be ready. And so I talk
Interesting.
about that because I got really interested in that, because when I tore my ACL, it was the week before my period. And so I
Oh,
started to
really?
think, was I because I was skiing, and I was like, was my reaction time just super bad because of the state of my cycle, right?
Interesting.
And so things like that. And then also you see right before ovulation a little bit of a peak in estrogen. So if you're tracking
Yeah.
your cycle and can know when you're going to ovulate, you can kind of right before you ovulate, those like 2 days before you ovulate is when you have a peak in
Mhm.
estrogen. So that's the injury, could be an injury
Yeah.
window. And then that second half of your cycle seems to be an injury window. And so, you can go to the extreme where Dr. Stacy Sims talks about, you should only be weight training once a week during the second half of your cycle, but then like 3 times a week during your period, which is very counter to what I think a lot of women believe, or we've come to
Right.
learn from just how we feel. We're like, well, I don't want to go work out on when
Yep.
I'm on my period. But science is showing that's when your all of your hormones are low during that. So you actually could hit your peak performance during that time. So, and it actually helps with a lot of the symptoms. So I think it's interesting because now that we're actually looking at the science,
Oh my
it's
gosh.
kind of demystifying and also like completely counter to what we've really been believing.
Well,
And again, so it's kind of evolving, but I think that's something. And again, I would say what I've done is just tracking how I feel, because again, this
yeah,
could be different for everybody. But for me,
sure.
I'm always super tired and have a really hard time lifting weights right before my period. And I realized, oh, it's because my body like doesn't function as well during
It's
this
not.
time
Well,
and adjusting accordingly.
yeah, and everything you're saying, like I'm sitting there going, this is truly very specific. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is you picked a very hard. I mean, good job, but
Oh,
holy
thank you.
crap. You
Uh,
picked a very hard thing because you really can't pinpoint. Like you said, the Norwegian team, well, their environment's different, their food is
totally.
different. I
Yeah.
mean, you got those things. I mean, so and your cultural differences, I mean, those things
Mm-hmm.
change. Your just your
Stress
background.
levels.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what you do. Like one of the first things I always ask someone is when they come under our group is tell me a little bit about yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
then I specifically say, what do you have at home for support? Who's your support?
Yeah.
We have people that live alone. Well, that makes a huge difference. And I understand now, I can understand what makes them tick when they come on and they have a lot to say. They have nobody to share with, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then those people that have had the support, like I have with the husband that has a good job, I've been able to achieve a lot of goals because
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I've been able to have the support, someone that pushes me, someone that wants to see me at my best, someone who allows me
Mm-hmm.
to travel so that I can do things, learn things about myself, find my limits, push past
Mm-hmm.
my limits, and other people don't have that. I mean, there are so many dynamics. And when you're talking
Yeah.
about even a woman's cycle, we're not the same in that either. And that just
Yeah.
makes everything that more, well, this could work or this could work. There's no almost like
Yeah.
no magic pill for any of it, you
There's
know?
no magic pill, but I will say that, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying, like logging, because I think maybe this is
Yes.
like the takeaway message, rather like forget all
Yes.
the like deep science that I was just saying, but the
Right.
takeaway message there is as women, we are so intuitive. And I think we've been kind of taught out of it. In the sense of, we get just bombarded with messages of how to train. And again, all of it based on men.
Yeah.
And you need to go to the gym every day or like all these different things. And at the end of the day, women, we are so intuitive. And so I encourage women to just tap back into that, like really listen to your body
Yes.
and learn how to trust it, learn how to listen to it, learn how to accept it where it's at. And I think, especially as you're in the rehab process, with if you're having, as going through rehab for an amputation or trying to prevent injury as you learn how to not compensate with your limb and things like that, is one, stay active, like try to prioritize activity as much as you can. There's also
Right.
research about, as you strengthen the contralateral limb, it's strengthened, at least in ACL research. If you strengthen your contralateral limb, your affected knee will actually think it's just as strong. And so it'll kind of take the same progression. And so I could see how that could
Interesting.
translate to someone with an amputation, is like continue training that other leg because psychologically your body thinks it's an equal
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
um so it'll come back through the rehab process and you'll feel more
Yes.
comfortable. But as you're going through that, if there's a day that you're just absolutely tired, like rest your body. Like women do need more rest days and they need to give their body, make it a safe space, because I think progress will come if your body feels safe and if you are really tuning into it and giving it what it needs. And so I think tapping back into that intuition that we have as women rather
Mm.
than pushing, which is something I think our society, the hustle culture and push past your limits and all
Yep.
these things, that's like, again,
Yep.
tailored towards men because they don't have these fluctuations. So they are consistent.
Right.
We are inconsistent beings. Like, and I
Yes.
think embracing that and embracing that with joy and like love for how we're designed, because we are designed differently, like
Mm.
physiologically, and being empowered by that, saying, hey, this is a day that I just, need to
Just
rest,
can.
need to rest
Yeah.
my body. and loving it and learning to love that process of being different. And that's something that, as you're saying, the community of women is so important because it's such a countercultural experience and can feel
Yeah.
very isolating if you don't understand that it's a common experience.
Right. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if I could figure out a better way to end this interview. That was
Yeah.
perfectly stated and true, very true. And you know
Yeah.
what? On that note, I want to wrap it up on that. You spoke eloquently, you pulled it all together. We don't need to go into
Yeah.
anything else on that, but that is perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on, spending time discussing that research that you're doing. And, I pray that we can get some more women to get in there and use their
Mm-hmm.
experiences to help other women, whether it's an athlete or an amputee athlete, to get back to
Absolutely.
feeling okay with their body, with where they're at, and keeping injury at bay. And
Mm-hmm.
thank you from you out in California to me here close to Arizona. Love to have that. We have the West Coast on today from UCLA,
Yeah.
and appreciate your time. You keep trucking forward, and I can't wait to hear how the PhD paper wraps up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been such a fun time chatting and such an honor. So thank
I
you.
I appreciate you. All right, we'll talk soon. Yes.
Sounds good.